Good evening with people that are in this part of the world in the Americas, and good morning to our friends from the rest of the world in Asia. And it's my immense pleasure. I'm David Romo, your host for the APRU Indigenous Connections Seminar Series. For the people that don't know me yet, I'm an emeritus professor from Universidad San Francisco de Quito in Ecuador, and I have worked developing the program of ethnic diversity at the university, which incorporated indigenous and Afro-Ecuadorian students and other minorities to the university in a very successful program. I've been working with APRU Indigenous Knowledges Group since the creation of the group. And this seminar series, it's one of our first efforts to spread the knowledge that it's hold within several members of our working group. And tonight, we are very happy to receive hold on just a second. Okay. To receive Ana Luisa Muñoz Garcia from Chile. She has a PhD in educational culture, policy, and society from SUNY at Buffalo in the United States with a Fulbright scholarship. She's an associate professor at the Pontificia, Universidad Católica de Chile, and the Faculty of Education. She's the deputy director of the Gender Office at the School of Education and the director of the Department of Curriculum, Evaluation, and Technology. Her research focuses mainly on knowledge of academia, internationalization, and gender in higher education. She's leading a project in gender and knowledge in academia funded by the National Agency of Research and Development at Chile, ANID, for its acronym in Spanish. In addition, she is a feminist activist committed to dismantling patriarchal structures within academia and addressing gender violence and discrimination from various spheres. We welcome Ana Luisa, and I am certain that our conversation with you tonight will be as fruitful as the one previously with Reynaldo Novillos from the University of the Philippines. Thank you for having accepted our invitation and participating tonight with us.
Thank you. Thank you to APRU for having me here. Good night for me in Chile. I hope everyone is fine. What I want to share with you today is presentation about knowledge, decoloniality, and feminism, which is a conversation I am having with two projects, ongoing projects. However, before starting this conversation, I cannot start talking about decoloniality without to express my solidarity with Palestine and people in Gaza and this ongoing genocide that we are still watching every day. So the structure that I want to share with you is I will talk about the two projects I just mentioned it, but from there to expand the conversation about decolonial feminism in Abya and to end with some reflections about what it means to do research otherwise. That is something that I had been following for several years, I guess since I studied curriculum. So the two projects, the first one is called Mapping Knowledge Construction from Gender Perspective. This is a large project funded by ANIT, the National Agency of Research and Development. And the second one is Biographies of Women Schooling in Gualmapu. We put that name instead that we are not doing that, but I will tell you more when I got there. So the first one, the idea has been two ways to first analyze what gender policies are being developed in research, mostly in the system of higher education, but at the same time to understand which knowledge inform the creation of that policy. So it's not just to understand the gender policies, but also to understand the knowledge that is sustaining these policies. So maybe you know or not, but in 2018 in Chile, there was a massive and huge feminist movement, mostly in the system of higher education. Students occupy the universities. I am mentioning this because the impact of this feminist movement in the system of higher education, mostly in the universities, has been huge. We have been having different laws to address sexual harassment, protocols, policies, initiatives. Today, most of the universities have their own gender units and policies of gender issues, but at the same time, a protocol to address violence, discrimination because of gender. So since then, this project I am talking is a project of 4 years. This is my last year. And the first years, what we did, and I say we because this is a collective project, what we did was interviews mostly to policymakers and researchers in higher education in the 3 countries that this project is having participation. This is Chile, Argentina, and Norway. And then with this, in the second year, we did interviews mostly at the institutional level to people in the gender office, and we focus only in Chile. But at the same time, in order to understand what knowledge are informing the conversation, we went into a network analysis of what knowledge is being produced in Chile on gender issues. And the year number 3, what we did there was interviews to scholars from social science and natural science in those disciplines that are considered highly masculine, like, I don't know, in natural science, engineering, and social science, philosophy, history. And also we had been collecting narratives on gender and feminism in a online platform called Mapeando. And in the year number 4, this is this year, 2024, we had been doing some workshops and in order to analyze and talk and have a conversation about what we found the 3 previous year and writing too. So very shortly, this is the team. I am the PI of the research. Hilary Hiner and Andrea Lira are my co-researchers. But internationally also, I had been working with Rebecca Luna in this project and Catalina Trevisace in Argentina, Buenos Aires, and Andrea Torrano in Córdoba. Also, I am not including here the doctoral students and master students, but there is coordinators that have been working, other researchers that are working with me in different analyses and different research assistants. And because this platform I just mentioned at Mapeando, there are program designers and analysts in order to make sure the data collection is safe to work with that. So I will go very short with this part, but this is our preliminary analysis. This is the papers that some of them already published, others in writing, others in evaluation in some journals, but this is what we had been writing from this project. And I will just focus on one because it's important for the conversation I will have then in the next project, which is the first one on gender experts, grass and phantom creative exploration of knowledge construction. So this is a paper that was led by Andrea Lira. And what we did there was to question the idea of experts. Actually, the project has as first objective to interview and to work with policymakers and experts in gender issues in higher education. So in our first meeting with Andrea, at that moment, Hilary, Andrea said, okay, but who is the expert in gender issues? So we went in a very constructive and very deep conversation and reflections about who is the expert in gender. Because usually who sit in the table for the creation of policies of gender issues in higher education are not the activists, for example, who had been working and participating in an active way in the higher education system to create knowledge on gender issues. So from our activism, we were very aware of that. So at the moment to start to think about that, we start to write also about tensioning this idea from how we construct the idea of expert. So from there, we also were taking some methodological detour. And this is one, Mapeando, you have the the way to enter by the code. Kawimapiando is a platform that we took the idea from Queering the Map. And the idea is to collect narratives, feminist and gender issues, narratives, and that everyone can have access and read and connect with others through this platform. This is an open access platform, so everyone can access this data. It's in Spanish, it's in English. So this has been for 4 years already. So we have been collecting around more than 200 narratives now, and everyone can read it. So I invite you to write and to know a little more about this platform. Kawimapiando comes from the word kawin. Kawin in Mapuzungún, which is the language of indigenous Mapuche people, means relato, narrative. However, from the colonizer, it was usually translated as gossip, as something negative. So this is how we are trying also to resignify the concept. So this is the project I would like to share in most detail. This is a second project that is an unfunded project. It's called Biography of Women Schooling in the Wallmapu. And there we wanted, at the moment, we wanted to do a research to understand what was the schooling process of indigenous women, mostly in the south of Chile. Wallmapu is how we call the area of the south of Chile, usually called the frontiers for the colonizers. And it's a zone until now in conflict with the state of Chile because of the lands of indigenous. So how we started this conversation? This is an interview around 2017 of the congressman who he was explaining in the national television that indigenous should be grateful for the education that the state gave them instead of protesting or burning churches. So after that interview, the team, which is Andrea, she's the leader of this conversation, Elisa Loncon, and me, we start to think about what it means to talk about the other part of the story of the education or the schooling process in indigenous communities. All those pain stories, all these stories about punishment, about omission, about invisibilization, and so on. So to give a little context, Mapuche people are the largest group of indigenous nations in Chile. And while we have conversations and research on education in indigenous, usually is behind that logic to understand how we make indigenous students to be better in the schools, like comparing results in standardized tests or how they are doing in language. But there is not so much research about a decolonial conversation of the schooling process. It mostly focus on in women in this context. So our first step was to think about that. So what were our own stories about schooling? What were our positionality to do research? What we understand for knowledge? How much we knew about research and the gaze we have about what it means to do research in indigenous communities, that usually we don't have those kind of conversation before doing research. We usually have those conversations when you do field work, when you go into the field work. But in social science, those conversations before even asking a research question, before even deciding to do and connect with other scholars to do research, we don't have those spaces because usually research go very, very, very fast. So we started to say, if we are doing a research in this topic, what we have to do first is to think who we are in this process. So we took the notion of IPTAC and Weijam of research as refusal. So understanding first the complicity that research has in the past and now with violence, with indigenous communities. And to understand that also the academic knowledge had been a way to perpetuate those violence. That was our first kind of conversations and positionality in terms of how we will understand first this research. And then from there, we start to position what will be our leading questions. So first, to understand the statement that this is a feminist statement, that the personal is not only political, but also is intellectual, is theoretical, and it's central to the process of research. So from there to wonder how we conduct research and how we focus not on those stories of pain, just pain, but also in the process of power and the structures that make those stories of pain possible. And the most important part, what is the work we have to do before or previous to design a study or a research with indigenous communities? So in that conversation, we came out with 3 papers. These 3 papers are 5 years of work without doing any research, just the previous work, just the conversation of the previous discussion. The first one, which is doing the work, and we name it in that way because we think that we have to do this work. We have to understand what are the entanglements of coloniality that exist nowadays in research with indigenous community. So how we did this? This was a very, we created, and it's created by other scholars too. We created a correspondence methodology. So what we did with apps, we were sending letters each other, and then answering those letters. And every 3 months we meet for a day, talking to talk about those letters and the answers we have each other. And we, the results of that conversation was the power that writing have as the colonial method, the possibility to pause, the possibilities to delete what we can consider then will be used as voyeurism in academia, with the pain that we have with this, the colonial history, the coloniality in our schooling. But at the same time, the importance of considering our different traditions. We have different epistemic traditions. I am a teacher. I am my background in history. Elisa is linguistic. Andrea is a teacher. So those differences, we didn't decide to have one voice. So what we were doing during the process of writing, for example, if you see the paper doing the work, we decided to keep those voices in conversation, not as one voice. And that was very useful later in participation with, for example, columns in newspaper and discussions in the public space. In the same way, establishing conversations and creating conversations and not defining one voice of three, in this case, 3 scholars. But at the same time, the importance to understand how settled colonialism operates in the production of knowledge. And for that, for us, was very important to be back to the history, to make historicity of the research. So in the second paper, which after all that year of creating letters, we decided to meet each other with other indigenous women. And we call that space Círculo de Moche, as a space of conversations of women, but at the same time as a methodology to think knowledge from outside of the space of the university. Actually, we were in another place that was not the university. We met in our houses. And there we were talking about what it means to be indigenous woman in schools. Most of us we grew up in the Mapuche area, but at the same time, the importance of places as ritual of methodology. There we were sharing food. It was a totally different conversation that we could have through an interview or even a focus group in another settings. But the most important conversation of this second paper was how we make memory as healing, how our memory were part of healing the stories that we have with the schooling in a colonial setting. And the last one was a paper we call Knowledge from the South. And what we were there was we were reflecting on what it means to write academically. What it means this writing in academic terms, and what stay and what is left out. So we did a conversation between our biographies, subjectivities, and territorialities. So we were constantly questioning in this paper how we do negotiate ourselves in the process of creating knowledge. And this part is important: from, within, with, and or relation to the academic spaces, and or refusal to them. So our conversation about our resistance, but how those resistance, taking the words of Sandy Grande, implies also implies also a re-existence in those spaces, and how and with whom we come to know. And from there, even conversations about politics of citation, with whom we work, with whom we don't even think to consider we can create knowledge, coming back up to the idea of activism and how those spaces usually are not considered as spaces of creation of knowledge. So the conversation in that paper was who produced knowledge, how, where, and for what aims, what knowledge are usually deleted or erased or omitted, and how we position those visible, made visible those invisible zones, taking the words of Tolly Hernandez. So those projects, the one about knowledge and feminism and the one of knowledge and decoloniality, made me think how I could create a bridge between decoloniality and feminism in my own conversation. And mostly because there were people that were asking me, hey, what is feminism in decoloniality and what is decoloniality in feminism? How I can explain that conversation. So I took the conversation of Lugones, which is very interesting about this, how we define or how we understand the two epistemic sources that are connecting the colonial feminism. And Lugones said, the colonial feminisms come from the colonial Latin American and Caribbean project, but also from the feminist criticisms from Black feminists, women of color, Chicanas, Latin American, feminist autonomy movement, indigenous feminism, and communitarian feminism. So when you see the colonial feminism, it's very diverse in Abya itself. So in the first case, the three big concepts, I put all of them separated from the concept because I feel all of them have something independent that usually we put each concept with one author: coloniality of power, coloniality of being, and coloniality of knowledge, in the ways that the coloniality is a racial, social, political, hierarchical order that is imposed by the colonial European colonialism in Latin America. But at the same time, that it doesn't just impact the social order, but also our mind, our body, who we are being with others, and how we understand with the nature, with the spaces, with the territory, with ourselves. So from feminism, similar to other feminism, the colonial feminism critiques the idea of feminism as universal, or this idea of women as homogeneous category, for example. So something that for me is very important, it has been relevant also for the research, this one and the previous one, is the recognition that feminism entered into academia usually as gender issues, but it's coming from activism and social movement, and in the struggle for the land and gathering those knowledge that are usually considered illegitimate, or those knowledge that usually are omitted or left out of the academic spaces. But at the same time, that the colonial feminism recognized that the political standpoint that feminism have involves the consideration of body as territory. And Ochikuriel will say also the sexuality and imaginaries and ways of being in the world. The body is, from this perspective, the body is a political territory, and is a political territory in a struggle, in constant struggle. So these two perspectives, in some ways, plus the research I have been sharing with you today, makes me to think some reflections about what it means to do research otherwise, which is something I and my colleagues also, we had been following during the past years. First is the invitation to disrupt what is considered knowledge and research within the university. Usually we take for granted that knowledge, we all understand what knowledge is. And usually knowledge is reduced to the idea of something encapsulated, something as a product. So it's important to have that conversation. How do you understand knowledge? Where do you learn to produce knowledge? Where do you think we can produce knowledge? With whom we connect in that knowledge productions? Which knowledge are validated or not? And that conversation are decolonial as well as feminist, and are so relevant today when you want to interrupt the perpetuation of coloniality or the violence of coloniality with indigenous communities or with other communities that had been historically in the margins. But at the same time, what actions I can do to amplify those knowledge in plural? I know in English doesn't exist the word in plural, but in Spanish we have it, that are dancing or are moving in the margins of these academic spaces. And if you pay attention, you can find them. But then when you recognize them, how you amplify, what are the actions that we can do to amplify those? And something that I learned so much from my colleague, Andrea Lira, and also from my readings with IFTAC and other colleagues, to pay attention to the damage of the colonial logic in the research or in the production of knowledge. So part of me want to end with this, something that we wrote in the last paper, that knowledge tells us who we are and who we are not, which is very important when you want to understand who you are and in your spaces, in your own communities, but at the same time in those communities, academic communities that you participate or enter. The context and places to which we belong and feel like home, and where we are not welcome. It allows us to wander around while foreign in the places that had been taken away from us. These are the borders we know and inhabit. That is the stories of pain, violence, and genocide we know and experience every day in the places in which we work. So last, this is a book I had been working with other colleagues as editor, Catalina Trevesace. There is more than 20 colleagues from Mexico, Argentina, and Chile. And it's called Feminism in Spanish, Feminism in the Threshold of the Academy. It's coming out next month. And the interesting is what we have been discussing here is mostly how feminism move or negotiate itself in the process of construction of knowledge in academic spaces. So I invite you can look at the book, and thank you very much to APRU for this opportunity to share some thought. I hope we can have now a productive and thoughtful conversation from this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ana Luisa. I've certainly learned several things that are very new to me and the kinds of things that we do usually. And I have to pick up something that caught my attention was that one of the places where you have a majority of men was in the sciences, in the biological science and the engineering sciences. And it's, at least in my experience here at the university in general, we now are having a bigger number of women than men in biological sciences roles. In my university, the vice president or vice provost of the university, it's a biologist, a very renowned biologist, Andrea Encalada. And the College of Biological Sciences had for about 15 years a female dean and a female vice dean. So, and I'm not saying that we are the rule, but Universidad San Francisco holds a higher number of PhD teachers in the country. So that should be a reflection of the level of production. But I agree with you a lot that in the engineering sciences, then the numbers are really skewed, and breaking grounds in there has been really critical in a lot of ways. So we're asking people to start writing questions, but until this warms up, I would like you to please expand a little bit more about what this platform, Kawi Mapeando, it's doing. And why should we go in there, and what kinds of things are we going to find? Because it sounds like that's a crucial product of your work. You're muted. You're
Sorry,
muted.
I was thinking about what you say on making or creating the possibilities that more women have access in higher education. Actually, in Latin America, the number of women are higher than men in higher education in general. The issue is there that participation and access to higher education doesn't mean equality, doesn't mean that we reach maybe a good place or what is meant to be a woman. Mostly because, again, there is this category of women that is very homogeneous. You know, we are not questioning which women are going into higher education first, but second, what happened next? So access and participation is a first step, and then is what we do there. And patriarchy, you were asking me another thing before the presentation. Patriarchy is something that is a structure that go across if you're indigenous or not indigenous, or women or men. This is something that is a colonial structure that all of us, women and men, are participating. So, but coming back to the question of Kawi Mapeando, for us, Kawi Mapeando has been a very productive space to talk with others. When you read the narratives, we have it in English and in Spanish. Mostly the narratives are coming in Spanish at this moment. When you read the narratives, you can see that you are in those narratives too, but at the same time, then you find that other people are writing narratives in response to the other narratives that are already there for everyone to read. But at the same time, it's data that we cannot have access without a space that is anonymous first, but open for everyone. Because usually when you go into interviews or when you go to collecting something, you go into a very narrow circles of research. In this platform, everyone can have access. It's not massive yet, but we hope that more people can write there and talk with the platform. Also because we open the data to everyone who can access that. We have some kind of protocols, but in order to guarantee ethical use of the data, but it's open. And that is another thing that for us is very, very important. There is another question in the chat, I guess.
We have from Nolani, does this work feel like it empowers you or increases your frustration to work with academy?
Thanks, Noleani. I will say both, which is really sad and complex at the same time. You know, part of me sometimes, when you have consciousness about how coloniality, but at the same time, how violence operates in academic spaces with the knowledge we produce, but that also involves the ones who produce knowledge. You know, from feminism, we don't separate knowledge from the ones who produce those knowledge. So when you have consciousness about that, you can see violence where others see nothing. And that sometimes is very frustrated, it's very painful. But at the same time, you find others, when I say others, other feminist scholars, other decolonial scholars, indigenous scholars, with whom you can have the solidarity, but at the same time, the conversations that you need in order to move forward and not leave an academy, even that some do it. Not my case, but for example, from Sandy Grande, something very important I learned was to unlove university, and to understand that to unlove university, it doesn't mean I don't want to be in academia. It means that I understand that structure of the university has been a patriarchal structure, is a colonial structure in which I am involved. And that gives you some freedom, you know, that gives you the possibility to think where your loyalty is. Is your loyalty with an institution, or your loyalty is with knowledge, with people? And that for me has been liberated. I mean, I feel more freedom in some ways, and to understand that there are many stuff that doesn't depend on me, just on me, that are beyond me. And that also make you really write what you want, because if not, you are constantly trying to reach what the university wants, what the trajectory, you know, the tenure track process wants. And at the end, you end up working not for what you are passionate about, or for what you feel that is important to say, to write, to discuss. but for what they are asking. And I think when you unlove you understand what it means to unlove the university, you understand that your loyalty is with others, other things that are not the institution itself.
Okay, we have another question now from Freddy Grefa, and it says, what is your experience with the idea of indigenous feminisms? Are we perhaps falling into a process of coloniality of power by thinking that indigenous women think the same way as white women?
Yeah. First, thank you for the question, Freddy. It's a really good question. First, I usually don't call indigenous feminism because I don't know so many that consider themselves indigenous feminism. I usually use the idea or the notion of indigenous knowledge and feminist knowledge of the colonial knowledge. And usually the colonial knowledge is coming from Afro-Caribbean colleagues. So I think that is very complex. I don't consider myself as indigenous feminist. I consider a woman who is the colonial feminism, which is not the same. So I am very careful about that. Many women don't declare the same or don't consider themselves indigenous feminism precisely because feminism is a colonial concept too. You know, it's a concept that is not coming from feminist perspective. That is what I'm not sure I answered with that your question, but that is what you invite me to think.
I should read what Noelani is saying. Thank you for sharing and also publishing on this important topic. Yes, we do this work for our people and not for the university. And thank you from Cam Carr. Thank you for your chat. So important to recognize the multiple levels of colonial playing out of our bodies as women of color from different territories that are often bound to different narratives that stick to our bodies. I don't see another question coming in. I am a bit curious. Now I'm trying to understand a little bit about how is the situation in Chile. Do you think that the discrimination against indigenous women get harder? I'm sorry, for indigenous people gets harder for indigenous women at any level, schooling, university, work?
Yes, definitely. Definitely. We have an amazing, as an example, we have an amazing process of trying to change the constitution in Chile during the past 3 years. And the person who was leading that process was Elisa Loncon, actually one of the colleagues I had been writing with. And the type of violence she was getting because she was indigenous, it was something unthinkable before that. And that was the fact that she was the president and leading that process emerged all the racist comments that you can find in media and television. She was usually questioned because of her doctorate. They were asking their degrees, even their primary school degrees, because for many people, she didn't know how even to speak when she was a professor. She's a professor, actually. So when you think about what is the violence that indigenous women live here, definitely is higher than any other women, together with immigrants women too, Afro-immigrants women. And I guess for us, the racism that emerged with the fact that Elisa was leading that process, it was very, very, was complex, but at the same time, something that we were not expecting at that level. Never. Actually, I had been writing another paper with Hilary Hiner about academic rage. The rage we have about all those kind of violence she was living from the media, but from the Republicans in the Congress, and that university was not prepared to defend her. And that for us was very complex too, you know, to see that she was an academic as us, and we were not seeing our institutions taking positions and defending her in front of the Congress or in front of the violence that she was living every single day for months. And I guess that explains a lot about how universities are not prepared usually for this kind of political struggle about racism, how racism and misogyny operate together. You know, like that was for me very hard to see and painful too.
Okay, there are comments here. Linda Waymery says, I was privileged to host Elisa Loncon at the University of Auckland yesterday. She's amazing. She's keen to learn more about APRU, APRU and the working group, and it's looking forward to the November meeting in Santiago. I'm looking forward to the meeting too as well. This that you just said brings me another question. Where do you see more support on for women in academics, in private universities or in public universities?
I think universities in general have small spaces that Indigenous can participate. I will say in large universities. You know, here we have that divisions that there are public university and private university for sure, but also we have those universities are large research university and more smaller universities. And I guess in research university, there are more possibilities you can participate because there are some centers of research, and because there are other opportunities that you can grow as researchers. I will say in a smaller universities it's more complex, but it depends on the university. There are a small university, for example, in the South that have an amazing programs of interculturality with Indigenous academics or Indigenous professors. So that is relative in the case of Chile. I will not, it's difficult to make that division between private and public and what are supporting more academics. I would say in general, they are opening spaces for Indigenous academic because sometimes it's kind of embarrassed, you know, to see that there is, for example, in my School of Education, around 300 professors, there are one. So it's, they are doing some kind of efforts to bring more Indigenous professors to the university. However, sometimes the conditions are very complex to reach. So we are in the same game, you know, of competitive competition for funding, which does not make a difference, you know, even in a scholarship, when you see if you're Indigenous, receive kind of a score for being Indigenous and being in competition with the rest, and it's very, very small. So that's
my question actually was even just gender-wise. And I wanted to know if the public sector it's more open to bringing women into academia and opening the spaces, or private universities are doing a better job.
I will say that across the system, they are trying to bring more. I will not say there is one on, honestly, because most of the university nowadays, because of the feminist movement, after the constitutional process, they are doing some kind of change in order to have or create more access for women or Indigenous women to the university. But this is across the system, you know, and most of the focus has been STEM, you know, science, mathematics, technology, engineer, and in social science is where most of feminicized areas are, so like education, health.
Yeah, I'm going to encourage people in the audience to send some more questions. We have 5 more minutes before we start closing out, so please go ahead. Okay. Thank you, Linda. Your research seems to demand the researcher to be deeply reflective and critical of their own research practice. How does this translate into specific research methods and strategies?
I guess something, again, I learned from my colleague, Andrea Lira, the one I had been mentioning several times, is to open to play with methods. And something before this research, the two ones that I was presenting to you, I was not so open about that. I was not traditional. But this idea of playing with methods, for example, in the last two papers I wrote with a research assistant, but also with a doctoral student, what we did there was we create a narrative with all the interviews. So one of the team that was across the interviews in the first research project of mapping knowledge in gender issues, it was epistemic exclusion, similar to epistemic injustice. So when we try to make form about how epistemic exclusion is taking form in the institution, we created a narrative, was one narrative with different quotes. And then what we did was to share that narrative and read out loud with different scholars. So we were reading that narrative and the fact that, and commenting the narrative. And the issue was that for several, most of the ones who were in the room, usually that narrative, we were part of that narrative. That narrative was making sense to everyone in one part of the entire collective narrative. So the idea of creating collective narrative as methodology was something that we start doing with the idea of playing with the data, opening to let it go, to say, this is something that we can do it in a different way. Let's try it. And not usually get close in one methodology, just interview, just one focus group. But that's why I talk about methodological detour, because it's something, of course, I have to justify with ethical committee, sorry, and so on, because this is a project that has funding. And we do all that, but we open to this idea of how we can change the ways that we are trying to talk and create knowledge together. And because I work on academic issues, most of my interviewees or people I talk with are academics too. So that has been something that has been really useful. More than thinking what methodology, is thinking what works to think together, what works to create something different and expand the conversation we already have. In which way we say something different and reflective, of course, thoughtful with all the theories and the books that we usually read with other authors, with other colleagues. But opening with that, for me, has been very important, how we use, even, for example, the public voice as data. And so we have been working with columns that other colleagues write, and from their writing papers too, and reflecting on the issue, because knowledge is not just in the papers we read, the book we read, or the university spaces. Knowledge is around the media, in newspapers, in the television, in the protests, in the streets, and in the drawing, the last paper we were working was this idea of the arpilleras, when you work with gender. No, it's not gender, it's with scrap. I don't remember the word now, but it's looking knowledge where usually we dispose about those knowledge. I don't know if it makes sense. Sometimes it's difficult to explain English because I don't speak English every day, but because also are other papers I am working with other people, but had been really important to do that, to let it go and open to other ways to create knowledge in spaces and places and with people that we usually think usually are not considered creators of knowledge.
Well, what came up to my mind right away when you were saying this is how to. It just brought me back to this experience when I was beginning to do my PhD research, and I started asking indigenous people for the names of frogs, and it was and I went with this acceptance that there was knowledge there that I could get to help me in what I was doing. And when I asked men, I had very few good responses.
Yeah.
And then when I asked women, it was amazing because they even had um, a category for frogs.
Mhm.
And, the funny part of this is that I started thinking, why? And it was the simple fact that men don't hunt frogs for food, while
Mhm.
women will use them if they need for food or for for whatever.
Yeah.
And that make this difference. And I think I picked up the methodology of how you do things. It can change drastically the results that you get. Okay. Um, Adria, I'm sorry, Ana Luisa, thank you so very much. It's been a very wide, eye-opening experience to learn these things that we don't usually put into perspective in our everyday work. I want to also thank the support we get from Adriana and David and the whole APRU team to get these things rolling. And I want everybody to invite everybody for our next series, talk in the series, titled Navigating Western Academic Spaces and the Foster Napo Runa Thoughts with Freddie Grefa from USFQ. My very proud colleague and one of the first students that we admitted at the Universidad San Francisco de Quito, and now very proudly for us, one of the members of our academia community. With this, I thank everybody for your presence.